The crisp autumn air carried whispers of the approaching winter as Jackson Pierce adjusted his worn jacket, a deliberate choice that concealed the man who had built the largest tech investment empire on the West Coast. At 42, with assets exceeding $11 billion, Jackson had grown weary of the superficial relationships that seemed to multiply alongside his wealth. Today marked the beginning of an experiment, one that had been brewing in his mind since his last disappointing relationship ended 6 months ago. The coffee shop nestled in downtown Portland wasn't one he would typically frequent. The cozy corner had mismatched furniture, chipped mugs, and a clientele that clearly worked for their living. Jackson had swapped his designer watch for a cheap knockoff, traded his tailored suits for thrift store finds, and parked his collection of luxury cars in favor of public transportation. His normally perfectly groomed appearance had given way to a 3-day stubble and slightly disheveled hair. "Black coffee, please," Jackson said, placing a carefully counted $3.75 on the counter, making a show of checking his pockets to ensure he hadn't missed any change. "Room for cream?" asked the barista, a young man with an elaborate sleeve of tattoos. "No, thank you, just black is fine," Jackson replied, his eyes scanning the busy morning crowd. That's when he first noticed her. At a corner table, a woman with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun was simultaneously typing on a laptop, sipping coffee, and keeping a watchful eye on a little girl who appeared to be about 5 years old. The child was carefully coloring in a book, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The woman's expression held a mixture of determination and exhaustion that Jackson found instantly compelling. Taking his coffee, Jackson deliberately chose the table next to theirs, pulling out a weathered paperback he'd purchased for this charade. He pretended to read while actually observing the woman and child. The little girl dropped her crayon, which rolled toward his feet. "I got it," Jackson said, retrieving the purple crayon and holding it out to the child with a smile. "What do you say, Zoe?" the woman prompted. "Thank you, mister," the little girl replied with a gap-toothed grin. "I'm Jackson," he said, extending his hand first to the child and then to her mother. "I'm Rebecca," the woman replied, her handshake firm but brief. "And you've met my daughter, Zoe. Sorry if we're disturbing your reading." "Not at all. Dostoevsky can wait," Jackson said, holding up his copy of Crime and Punishment. "That's some serious concentration happening over there." He nodded toward Zoe's coloring book. Rebecca smiled, and Jackson noticed the small lines that formed at the corners of her eyes. She's working on a masterpiece for her grandmother's birthday. Their conversation might have ended there had Jackson's coffee not chosen that moment to slosh over the rim of his mug, splattering onto his papers. As he scrambled to save his belongings, Rebecca quickly offered napkins from her table. "Thank you," Jackson said, dabbing at the moisture. "I've got a job interview in an hour, and showing up with coffee-stained papers probably wouldn't make the best impression." He watched as Rebecca's expression shifted subtly, a flash of empathy crossing her features. It was the opening he needed. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked, glancing at his papers. Jackson had prepared for this. "Site support, mostly freelance, but I'm hoping to land something more stable." He gestured to the papers, which were actually printouts of a basic resume he'd created for his character, a down-on-his-luck tech worker with decent skills, but an employment gap. "The market's been tough lately," Rebecca nodded knowingly. "Tell me about it." "I juggle 3 different jobs myself: virtual assistant during the day, this place on weekends, and online tutoring in the evenings after Zoe goes to bed. Mommy's super busy," Zoe chimed in, not looking up from her coloring. "But she tells the best bedtime stories ever." Jackson felt a genuine smile form. "I bet she does." Over the next 40 minutes, their conversation flowed naturally. Jackson learned that Rebecca had been raising Zoe alone since her husband died in a car accident 3 years ago. She had put her journalism career on hold, cobbling together flexible work arrangements to be present for her daughter while still making ends meet. What struck Jackson most was the complete absence of self-pity in her narration. Rebecca spoke matter-of-factly about her challenges, but with an underlying current of fierce determination. "I should get going," Jackson finally said, glancing at his watch. "Don't want to be late." "Good luck with your interview," Rebecca said sincerely. "I hope it works out for you." "Thanks. Maybe I'll see you both around sometime," he ventured, feeling oddly nervous for someone who regularly negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Rebecca's smile was warm, but non-committal, We're here most Saturday mornings. Zoe likes their hot chocolate. It has marshmallows, Zoe explained seriously, as if this detail was of vital importance. As Jackson walked away, his mind was already formulating the next phase of his plan. Initially, he had envisioned his experiment broadly, pretend to be of modest means to find someone who would care about him regardless of his wealth. But now, Rebecca and Zoe had given his abstract concept a specific focus. The following Saturday found Jackson back at the cozy corner, arriving 15 minutes earlier than the previous week. He chose a table with a clear view of the entrance and nursed his coffee while pretending to review job listings on his phone. When Rebecca and Zoe entered, bundled against the increasingly cold weather, he felt an unexpected flutter of anticipation. "Jackson!" Zoe spotted him first, waving enthusiastically. Rebecca looked up, surprised recognition crossing her face. "How did the interview go?" she asked after they had ordered and approached his table. Jackson had rehearsed this part. "They went with someone with more recent experience," he said, injecting just the right amount of disappointment into his voice. "But I've got 2 more possibilities lined up for next week. Would you like to sit with us?" Rebecca offered, gesturing to their usual corner table. "Unless you're busy with your job search." "I could use a break, actually," Jackson replied, gathering his things. Over hot beverages, coffee for the adults and the promised marshmallow-topped hot chocolate for Zoe, Jackson continued building his fictional life story, carefully constructed to elicit sympathy without seeming pathetic. He spoke of losing his steady tech job during company downsizing, of burning through his modest savings, of the challenges of finding new employment at 42 when younger, cheaper talent was abundant. What Jackson hadn't prepared for was how effortlessly Rebecca saw through his superficial narrative to ask probing questions about his actual interests, his perspectives on current events, his thoughts on books and music. For someone accustomed to people interested primarily in his wealth or influence, her genuine curiosity about him as a person was both refreshing and disarming. As their meeting drew to a close, Jackson found himself reluctant to end it. "I was thinking of grabbing lunch at the food trucks down the street," he said. "Would you and Zoe like to join me?" Rebecca hesitated, and Jackson could almost see the mental calculations happening behind her eyes. A single mother weighing the propriety of extending casual coffee conversation into something more, perhaps also calculating the additional expense against a tight budget. "My treat," he added quickly, "to thank you for the job search encouragement." "We can pay our own way," Rebecca replied, with a gentle firmness that Jackson found himself admiring. "But yes, lunch sounds nice, doesn't it, Zoe?" The little girl nodded enthusiastically, already packing up her coloring supplies. As they walked toward the food carts, Zoe skipping slightly ahead, Jackson realized that what had begun as a calculated experiment was rapidly evolving into something he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was simply enjoying someone's company without any agenda or expectation. And that, he thought as he watched Rebecca laugh at something her daughter said, might be the most valuable discovery of all. 3 weeks into his experiment, Jackson found himself settling into a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. Saturday mornings began at the cozy corner with Rebecca and Zoe, followed by some activity that Jackson would suggest casually, a visit to the Children's Museum, exploring the weekend farmers market, or simply walking through the tree-lined parks of Portland as the last autumn leaves clung desperately to their branches. Today, they were at Rebecca's modest 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the city's east side. Jackson had offered to help fix her leaky kitchen faucet after she mentioned it during their last meeting. The invitation into her home marked a shift in their developing friendship, a small token of trust that didn't escape his notice. "Hand me the wrench?" Jackson asked, his voice echoing slightly from beneath the sink where he lay on his back, examining the pipework. Rebecca placed the tool in his outstretched hand. "I really appreciate this. The building manager said he'd get to it eventually, but his definition of eventually tends to be rather flexible." "No problem," Jackson replied, tightening a connection. In truth, his plumbing experience was limited to watching instructional videos online the night before, but the simple repair gave him a genuine sense of satisfaction that signing acquisition paperwork never had. "I think that should do it." He slid out from under the sink, accepting Rebecca's hand to help him up. Their fingers remained connected a moment longer than necessary, and Jackson felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. He quickly turned his attention to testing the faucet, relieved when no water dripped from the pipes below. "Success," he announced, washing his hands at the now functional sink. "My hero," Rebecca said with a mock bow. "How can I ever repay you?" "I'll accept payment in the form of that coffee you're brewing," Jackson replied, inhaling the rich aroma that filled the small kitchen. While Rebecca poured their coffee, Jackson took in the details of her home. The apartment was small but meticulously organized, with second-hand furniture that had been carefully chosen for both function and comfort. What struck him most were the personal touches. Zoe's artwork adorned the refrigerator. Family photos lined the narrow hallway, and small potted plants occupied every available windowsill. It was a stark contrast to his own sprawling, professionally decorated penthouse that, despite its opulence, had never felt this welcoming. "Mommy, can I show Jackson my room?" Zoe asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "If Jackson wants to see it," Rebecca replied, handing him a steaming mug. "Lead the way," Jackson said, following the enthusiastic child down the short hallway. Zoe's room was a testament to Rebecca's creativity, despite limited resources. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, with hand-stenciled butterflies dancing across one wall. A small bookshelf overflowed with library books and well-loved stories. The twin bed was covered with a patchwork quilt that Rebecca later explained had been made by her grandmother. "And this is Mr. Whiskers," Zoe declared, holding up a one-eared stuffed rabbit that had clearly been her companion for many years. "It's very nice to meet you, Mr. Whiskers," Jackson said solemnly, shaking the rabbit's worn paw. "You have a lovely home." Zoe beamed, then proceeded to introduce him to every toy and treasured object in her collection. Jackson listened attentively, struck by how the child's prized possessions were not expensive gadgets or trendy toys, but items that carried stories and emotional significance. Later, as they sat at the small kitchen table eating a simple lunch of sandwiches and soup, Jackson found himself sharing more authentic parts of his own history than he had intended. His parents' early struggles, his scholarship to college, his first job in the tech industry. He carefully edited out the details of his meteoric rise and current wealth, but the core of his story, the values his parents had instilled, his passion for innovation, his belief in hard work, was genuine. "So what happened?" Rebecca asked, her perceptive gaze making Jackson shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You clearly had a successful career trajectory. How did you end up job hunting at 42? Jackson had prepared for this question, but in the moment his carefully constructed backstory felt hollow. "Poor investments," he said finally, deciding a partial truth was better than an outright lie. "I made some choices I thought were smart at the time, but they didn't pan out." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "Life has a way of throwing curveballs when we least expect them. Mommy says when bad things happen, we just have to find a new path," Zoe contributed, dunking her sandwich into her soup with focused precision. "Your mommy is very wise," Jackson replied, catching Rebecca's eye across the table. The smile they shared felt like a private understanding. After lunch, while Zoe napped, Rebecca and Jackson sat in the small living room, their conversation flowing easily from books they'd both enjoyed to their favorite places in Portland. Jackson was careful to mention only locations that would be accessible to someone of modest means, though he longed to tell her about the breathtaking view from his private helicopter or the small island he owned off the coast. "Can I ask you something personal?" Rebecca said during a lull in the conversation. Jackson tensed slightly but nodded. "Of course. Why are you spending your Saturdays with a struggling single mum and her 5-year-old? I'm sure there are more exciting ways for a single guy to spend his weekends." The question caught Jackson off guard. In his experience, people rarely questioned why he chose to spend time with them. His wealth and influence were typically considered reason enough. Rebecca's straightforward inquiry demanded an equally honest response. "I enjoy your company," he said simply. "Both of you. It's refreshing." "Refreshing?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Jackson chose his next words carefully. "Most of my adult life has been focused on career advancement. Recent events have made me reassess my priorities. Spending time with you and Zoe reminds me of what's actually important." Rebecca studied him for a long moment. "There's more to your story than you're telling me, isn't there?" Jackson felt a flicker of panic. Had she somehow discovered his true identity? "What makes you say that?" "Just a feeling," she replied with a slight shrug. "You have calluses on your hands from your supposed desk job. You quote literature most IT guys wouldn't read, and sometimes you look at ordinary things, like Zoe's excitement over feeding ducks or my ancient coffee maker, with this expression of wonder as if you're seeing something for the first time. Jackson swallowed hard. Everyone has layers, Rebecca. Indeed they do, she agreed, not pushing further. More coffee? As October gave way to November, their Saturday ritual expanded to include occasional weekday dinners when Rebecca's schedule allowed. Jackson invented consulting gigs to explain his flexible schedule and modest income while carefully maintaining his disguise. He found himself looking forward to these simple meals around Rebecca's small table, to Zoe's excited retellings of kindergarten adventures, to the warm domesticity that had been entirely absent from his life of luxury. One Tuesday evening, after Zoe had been tucked into bed with Jackson permitted the honor of reading the bedtime story, he and Rebecca sat on her small balcony despite the chill, sharing a bottle of inexpensive wine. "I have a confession to make," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice quiet but determined. Jackson's heart raced. "What's that?" "I looked you up online," she admitted. "After our second meeting, I was curious." Jackson nearly spilled his wine. "And what did you find?" he asked, striving for a casual tone. Rebecca took a sip from her glass before answering. "Not much. Just a basic LinkedIn profile that matches your story. A few mentions in tech forums from a few years back." She paused, studying his face in the dim light. "It's strange, though. For someone who worked in tech for 15 years, you have a surprisingly minimal digital footprint." Jackson relaxed slightly. His team had created a sparse but believable online presence for his alter ego. "I've always been private," he said. "Not much for social media." Rebecca murmured, unconvinced. "Well, whatever your story is, Jackson Pierce, I'm glad you dropped your crayon that day." "That was Zoe's crayon," he corrected with a smile. "Details." Rebecca waved her hand dismissively, then grew more serious. "You've been good for us, you know. Zoe talks about you all the time, and I—" She trailed off. "And you?" Jackson prompted gently. Rebecca looked directly into his eyes. "I've enjoyed having someone to talk to. Adult conversation is surprisingly rare in my world." The vulnerability in her admission touched something deep within Jackson. Before he could second-guess himself, he leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, questioning gesture that she returned after a moment of surprise. When they broke apart, Rebecca's expression was unreadable. "I should get some sleep," she said softly. "Early morning tomorrow." As Jackson drove back to his penthouse that night, the taste of inexpensive wine and Rebecca's kiss still lingering, he realized his experiment had evolved into something far more complicated than he had anticipated. The deception that had begun as a simple test now felt increasingly wrong with each genuine moment they shared. The first snow of the season dusted Portland on a Wednesday morning in early December, transforming the city into a pristine wonderland. Jackson stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the flakes swirl against the panoramic view of the city and the distant mountains, but his mind was elsewhere. For the past week, he had been wrestling with the growing discomfort of his deception. His phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. "Snow day, school cancelled. Zoe wants to know if you're free to help build her first snowman." Jackson smiled, imagining Zoe's excitement. Over the past 6 weeks, he had become a fixture in their lives, helping with household repairs, joining them for dinner several times a week, even attending Zoe's kindergarten Thanksgiving performance, where she had proudly introduced him to her teacher as "my mommy's special friend." "I'll be there in an hour," he texted back, already moving to his closet where his Jackson the IT consultant wardrobe hung separate from his designer clothes. As he dressed in jeans and a weathered sweater, Jackson's gaze fell on the business section of that morning's newspaper, where his actual photograph appeared alongside an article about his company's latest acquisition. The headline read, "Pierce Technologies expands empire with $3.2 billion healthcare startup purchase." The contrast between his two lives had never felt so stark. In one, he was celebrated for his business acumen and vast wealth. In the other, the one that increasingly felt more authentic, he was valued simply for being present, for reading bedtime stories and fixing leaky faucets. Jackson folded the newspaper and placed it in his desk drawer. Today was not the day for revelations. When he arrived at Rebecca's apartment complex, Zoe was already in the courtyard, attempting to roll a tiny snowball with mittened hands. Her face lit up when she spotted him. "Jackson, look at all the snow!" she exclaimed, running toward him with arms outstretched. He caught her in a hug, lifting her high. "It's beautiful. Perfect for snowman building." Rebecca emerged from the building entrance, carrying an assortment of potential snowman accessories. A carrot, some buttons, and a faded scarf. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, hair tucked under a knitted hat. Jackson's heart skipped at the sight of her. "I thought I had coal somewhere for the eyes, but apparently I'm not as prepared for snowman emergencies as I should be," she said with a laugh. "We can improvise," Jackson replied, setting Zoe down. "That's half the fun." They spent the morning in the courtyard, building not just one but 3 snowmen of decreasing size that Zoe declared was a snow family. Other children from the building joined them, and soon a full-scale snow sculpture competition was underway, with Jackson appointed as the official judge. Later, as they warmed up in Rebecca's apartment with hot chocolate, Zoe fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from the morning's excitement. "She'll sleep for hours," Rebecca said, gently draping a blanket over her daughter. "All that fresh air and excitement." "I should probably head out, let you have some quiet time," Jackson suggested, though he made no move to leave. Rebecca sat beside him at the kitchen table. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Her tone made Jackson instantly alert. "What's on your mind?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I've been offered a job, a real job, back in journalism." "Rebecca, that's wonderful," Jackson exclaimed, genuinely pleased for her. "Tell me about it." "It's with the Portland Tribune, an investigative reporter position, focusing on business and economic disparities in the city." Her eyes shone with excitement. "It's exactly the kind of work I was doing before David died, before everything changed." Jackson reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You'd be brilliant at that." "The problem is the hours," she continued. "It would mean more childcare for Zoe, which means more expenses. And the starting salary, while better than my cobbled-together jobs now, isn't exactly generous." Jackson fought the immediate urge to solve the problem with money, something that would have been effortless for the real Jackson Pierce. Instead, he asked, "When would you start?" "That's the thing," Rebecca replied, a note of tension entering her voice. "They want me to start an investigation immediately. They're looking into some of the major tech companies in the area and their impact on housing affordability and small businesses." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "Which companies?" Rebecca hesitated. "Several, but the main focus is Pierce Technologies. Apparently, its founder has been buying up significant real estate throughout Portland, driving up prices while maintaining a public image of philanthropy." The irony of the situation might have been comical if it weren't so potentially disastrous. Jackson struggled to keep his expression neutral. "Sounds like an important story." "It is," Rebecca agreed, studying his face. "But here's where it gets complicated. They want me to start Monday, and I need to make a decision by tomorrow. Taking this job would mean big changes for Zoe and me." She paused, then added softly, "And potentially for us." "Us?" Jackson echoed, his heart pounding. Rebecca's eyes met his directly. "Yes, us. Whatever this is between us, and I think we both know it's becoming something significant, it would be affected by me taking this job. My time would be even more limited, at least initially." Jackson swallowed hard. This was the moment to tell her the truth, to confess that he was the very billionaire she would be investigating. But looking at her hopeful expression, at the sleeping child on the couch, he couldn't bring himself to shatter the connection they had built. "You should take the job," he said finally. "It's what you've been working toward. We'll figure out the rest." Rebecca's smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd say that." She leaned across the table and kissed him gently. "Thank you for understanding." Later that afternoon, as Jackson left Rebecca's apartment with promises to return for dinner the next day, his mind raced with the impossible situation he had created. By tomorrow evening, he needed to either confess his true identity or end the relationship before Rebecca discovered it herself through her investigation. Back in his penthouse, Jackson called Marcus Whitfield, his closest friend and the CFO of Pierce Technologies. "I need your advice," Jackson said without preamble when Marcus answered. "Business or personal?" Marcus asked, accustomed to his friend's direct approach. "Both, actually. It's complicated." Over the next hour, Jackson explained the entire situation. His experiment, meeting Rebecca and Zoe, the developing relationship, and now the impending investigation. "Let me get this straight," Marcus said when Jackson finished. "You've been pretending to be an unemployed IT guy for nearly 2 months, dating a woman who has no idea you're worth billions, and now she's about to investigate you professionally?" "That about sums it up," Jackson admitted. "Well, you've really outdone yourself this time," Marcus replied with a low whistle. "You realize this could go very badly, right? Not just personally, but for the company's public image." "I know," Jackson sighed, "but that's not my primary concern right now." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "If I tell her the truth now, she'll likely never trust me again. If I don't tell her and she discovers it through her investigation, same outcome. But with added public humiliation," Marcus finished for him. After a pause, he added, "For what it's worth, I haven't seen you this invested in a relationship, ever. Maybe the truth is your only option, however difficult." After hanging up, Jackson spent a restless night weighing his options. By morning, he had made his decision. He would tell Rebecca everything over dinner that evening, face whatever consequences came, and hope that what they had built might somehow survive the revelation. Throughout the day, Jackson found himself distracted during meetings, his thoughts continuously drifting to the evening ahead. He cancelled his afternoon appointments and left the office early, stopping to purchase a small but elegant bracelet for Zoe, not an extravagant piece that would raise questions, but something special to mark the importance of the evening. For Rebecca, he carefully selected a first edition of her favorite novel, which she had once mentioned reading repeatedly from the public library during her college years. The gift felt appropriate, personal rather than ostentatious, yet still revealing something of his true capabilities. As evening approached, Jackson changed into casual but slightly nicer clothes than his usual disguise, still nothing that would telegraph wealth, but an outfit that more accurately reflected his actual taste. He was about to leave his penthouse when his phone rang with a call from an unknown number. "Is this Jackson Pierce?" a woman's voice asked when he answered. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Nurse Lawson from Providence Portland Medical Center. You're listed as an emergency contact for Rebecca Caldwell." Jackson's blood ran cold. "What happened? Is she all right?" "Ms. Caldwell was in a car accident this afternoon. She's in stable condition but has sustained some injuries requiring surgery. Her daughter is here as well, physically unharmed but quite upset. Ms. Caldwell asked specifically for you to come." "I'll be right there," Jackson said, already moving toward the door. Without thinking, he took his personal vehicle, a luxury SUV that he had carefully avoided using during his charade. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of anxiety, his earlier concerns about revealing his identity now trivial compared to Rebecca and Zoe's well-being. At the hospital, Jackson approached the information desk. Realizing too late that in his haste he was dressed in designer clothes, had arrived in an expensive vehicle, and was now about to use his real identification to access Rebecca's room. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, but he no longer cared. "I'm here for Rebecca Caldwell," he told the receptionist, producing his ID. "I received a call that she was in an accident." The receptionist directed him to the surgical waiting area on the 3rd floor. As the elevator doors opened, Jackson immediately spotted Zoe sitting with a hospital social worker, clutching Mr. Whiskers and looking terrified. "Zoe," he called softly, approaching slowly to avoid startling her. "Jackson!" she cried, jumping up and running to him. He caught her in his arms, holding her close as she sobbed against his shoulder. "Mommy's hurt. The car hit us and she wouldn't wake up and there was blood and I was so scared." "Shh, it's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Your mom is strong, and the doctors are helping her right now." Looking over Zoe's head, he addressed the social worker. "I'm Jackson Pierce. What can you tell me about Rebecca's condition?" The woman's eyes widened slightly at his name, a reaction Jackson had become accustomed to in his real life but had not encountered during his weeks with Rebecca. "Mr. Pierce, Miss Caldwell is in surgery for a broken leg and some internal bleeding. The doctor can provide more details when available. The child appears uninjured but was quite distressed, as you can imagine." Jackson nodded, still holding Zoe tightly. "I'll take care of her. Is there paperwork I need to complete?" As he settled into a waiting room chair with Zoe curled against him, Jackson realized that his carefully constructed experiment had come to an abrupt end. When Rebecca emerged from surgery, she would find not the struggling IT consultant she had come to care for, but Jackson Pierce, Billionaire CEO, a man whose company she had been hired to investigate. The irony was not lost on him as he comforted her sleeping daughter, wondering if this unexpected revelation would destroy everything they had built together. 3 hours passed in the sterile hospital waiting room, each minute stretching like an eternity as Jackson held the sleeping Zoe. The surgical resident finally appeared, her tired eyes scanning the room before landing on Jackson. "Mr. Pierce, Rebecca Caldwell is out of surgery and stable. The procedure went well. We've repaired the internal bleeding and set her broken leg. She's in recovery now." "When can we see her?" Jackson asked, careful not to disturb Zoe. "She's still under anesthesia, but you can see her briefly in about 30 minutes. She'll likely remain sedated through the night." Jackson nodded his thanks, then turned his attention to the hospital paperwork. Without hesitation, he listed himself as responsible for all expenses. When the billing coordinator's eyes widened at his information, he simply said, "Please ensure Ms. Caldwell receives the best care available. Cost is not a concern." The whispers started almost immediately. Hospital staff stealing glances, the occasional smartphone pointed discreetly in his direction. Jackson knew his cover was irreparably blown, but his only concern now was for Rebecca and Zoe. When Zoe stirred, Jackson explained that her mother was out of surgery and resting. The doctors fixed her leg and took good care of her. She's sleeping now, but she's going to be okay. "Promise?" Zoe asked, her small voice still trembling. "I promise," Jackson replied, realizing the weight of those words extended far beyond Rebecca's physical recovery. Later, as they stood at Rebecca's bedside, Jackson felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Her face was pale against the white hospital linens, a nasty bruise forming along her cheekbone, but her breathing was steady. Zoe clutched his hand tightly, uncertain about all the machines and tubes. "She looks like Sleeping Beauty," Zoe whispered. "She does," Jackson agreed softly. "And like Sleeping Beauty, she needs to rest to get better." After their brief visit, a kind-faced nurse approached them. "Ms. Caldwell won't wake until morning. You should take the little one home for proper rest." Jackson hesitated, reluctant to leave Rebecca alone. "Go," the nurse urged. "We have your number. We'll call if anything changes." After securing permission to take Zoe, Jackson faced a decision. Taking her to his penthouse would immediately reveal everything, but Rebecca's apartment held painful reminders of the accident. Ultimately, practicality won. Zoe needed familiar surroundings and her own bed. At Rebecca's apartment, Jackson helped Zoe through her bedtime routine, finding pajamas and supervising teeth brushing with awkward determination. When she asked for her favorite bedtime story, he read it twice, then stayed until she drifted to sleep. Mr. Whiskers clutched tightly against her chest. Alone in Rebecca's living room, Jackson surveyed the modest space that had come to mean more to him than his luxurious penthouse. On the coffee table lay a folder labeled Pierce Technologies Investigation, Preliminary Notes. With a weary sigh, he opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings about his company, printouts of property acquisitions, and notes in Rebecca's neat handwriting about potential angles for her investigation. The final page held a printed photograph of him at a recent charity gala, his real self, in an expensive suit, looking nothing like the man who had fixed her faucet and built snowmen with her daughter. Beside the photo, Rebecca had written, "Why does he look familiar?" Jackson closed the folder, the full weight of his deception settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. Tomorrow, when Rebecca woke, he would face the consequences of his actions. He spent the night on her couch, sleeping fitfully between calls to the hospital checking on her condition. Morning brought news that Rebecca was awake and asking for him, and for Zoe. After helping the little girl dress and explaining they were going to see her mother, Jackson steeled himself for what lay ahead. At the hospital, Zoe ran to Rebecca's bedside with a joyful cry. "Mommy, you're awake!" Rebecca's face, though pale and bruised, lit up at the sight of her daughter. "There's my brave girl," she said, her voice raspy as she embraced Zoe carefully, mindful of her IV lines. Jackson hung back, uncertain of his place in this reunion. When Rebecca's eyes finally met his, they held confusion and something he couldn't quite identify. "Zoe, honey," she said, not breaking eye contact with Jackson, "would you mind going with the nice nurse to get some juice? Mommy needs to talk to Jackson for a minute." After Zoe reluctantly left with the nurse, silence filled the room. Jackson stepped forward, stopping at the foot of her bed. "They're calling you Mr. Pierce," Rebecca finally said. "Not just Jackson, but Mr. Pierce. And the nurses are whispering about the famous billionaire in the surgical ward." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly on the blanket. "Care to explain?" Jackson took a deep breath. "My name is Jackson Pierce. I am the founder and CEO of Pierce Technologies." "The same Pierce Technologies I was hired to investigate," Rebecca clarified, her journalist's instincts evident even from her hospital bed. "Yes." "So everything was a lie? The struggling IT consultant, the job interviews, all of it?" Jackson moved closer, desperate to make her understand. "Not everything, not the things that matter." Rebecca gave a short, humorless laugh that transformed into a wince of pain. How convenient. And what was this, some kind of sick experiment? "Let's see how the poor single mom lives. Was I your poverty tourism?" "It wasn't like that," Jackson insisted, his voice low. "Yes, it started as an experiment. I wanted to find someone who would care about me, not my money. But what happened between us became real, Rebecca. More real than anything in my life." Rebecca turned her face away, tears threatening. "You watched me struggle. You sat at my table while I worried about making rent. You knew I was piecing together 3 jobs and you just played along." "I was going to tell you everything last night," Jackson said. "That's why I was coming over for dinner. I had decided to tell you the truth before you started the investigation." "How considerate," Rebecca replied, her voice sharp with hurt. "And now what? You've paid my hospital bills, I assume. Should I feel grateful that the billionaire who lied to me for 2 months has now swooped in to save the day?" Jackson felt each word like a physical blow. "I never meant to hurt you, but you did," she said simply. "You had countless opportunities to tell me the truth. Instead, you let me believe in someone who doesn't exist." "The person you know is real," Jackson insisted. "The only difference is my financial situation and my job." "Those aren't small differences, Jackson. You deliberately misrepresented yourself to gain my trust, to gain Zoe's trust." At the mention of her daughter, Rebecca's voice broke. "Do you have any idea what this will do to her? She adores you." Jackson had no answer for that. The thought of hurting Zoe was unbearable. Rebecca sighed, suddenly looking exhausted. "I think you should go." "Rebecca, please. I need time, Jackson. This is too much. Please respect that." Recognizing the futility of pushing further, Jackson nodded. "I understand, but I want you to know I'll cover all your medical expenses, no strings attached, and I've arranged for a home healthcare nurse to help when you're discharged." Seeing her begin to protest, he added, "You can refuse, of course, but please consider it for Zoe's sake." At the mention of practical arrangements, Rebecca's journalist instincts visibly took over. "What about Zoe? I can't take care of her properly like this, but I won't be separated from her." "I've taken a leave of absence from work," Jackson said, the decision made in the early morning hours. "If you'll allow it,